Thank you everyone for joining us this morning. So today I'd like to start us off thinking about social group living and some of the benefits of that. So while behavioral ecologists and evolutionary biologists have extensively documented the ways in which individuals must compete in order to survive, due to limited resources such as food, mates, and territory, there are many important ways in which they can combat this by joining other individuals and forming social groups. This way, they can increase their chances of survival and coordinate their efforts and care for their young, hunt for food, and importantly, protect one another from predators or competing groups. So in order to navigate such complex social group dynamics, species that live in groups must have the capacity to represent and track social relationships and use this knowledge to predict how others will behave. So for example, when facing an opponent, it's particularly important to be able to recognize when you're likely to be able to defend yourself or whether or not you'll need social allies to support you. So to illustrate this concept, imagine that you see two chimps about to engage in a physical fight. And because they're roughly equal in physical size, it may not be clear who would dominate the other. However, if we find out that the chimp on the right happens to have 3 alliance members to back him up, while the chimp on the left only has 1, what might we expect? So like other social animals, we might predict that the chimp on the right will be more likely to win in the competition because they have more social allies to support them. So today, I hope to shed some light on the kinds of abstract representations that infants have about the dynamics of intergroup relationships. And I'll begin by exploring whether preverbal infants, like many other social species, detect and track social alliances. So given that the ability to use numerical group size to infer dominance between groups has been evolutionarily prominent among a wide array of social species, I've explored whether or not infants may be born equipped with some cognitive mechanisms that allow detection and representation of social dominance. And to give you an idea of what we were showing infants, we had 2 groups, one larger than the other in terms of group size, but equated in surface area to ensure that neither group was considered physically larger than the other. However, the 2 competing agents were identical in size, and we wanted to know whether or not infants would expect the agent from the numerically larger group or smaller group to prevail in this competition. So we showed them 2 test outcomes. One in which the agent from the numerically smaller group would prevail at the expense of the agent from the numerically larger group, or one in which the agent from the numerically larger group would prevail. And so according to our hypothesis and what we would expect as adults, we would anticipate that the agent from the numerically larger group should be successful and be considered more socially dominant. And interestingly, with infants as young as 6 months of age, we found that they also expect the agent from the larger group to be socially dominant and win in a competition. So one of the questions now is, why are infants making this kind of assumption about who should get their way, even though both identical agents were the ones competing? So the difference between the 2 had to be something to do with their inferences between the groups. So whose group are they part of, and what kind of functional role are these group members playing during conflict? So we're wondering if infants really truly understand that there might be strength in numbers, and if so, are they sensitive to whether or not social partners are potentially available to help one another? So to directly start to address these questions, we wanted to see whether or not overall group size, so how large your coalition or how large your group is really the factor that infants might be using based on a Q-based structure to decide whether or not an agent from each group would be able to win in a conflict. So in order to sort of see whether or not it's just about how many people in your group versus who can see you in a conflict and can potentially help, we showed infants a slightly different version of the study from before. So we still had 2 groups of varying in numerical size. However, this time, both the group members are going to be hidden behind a platform and will be unable to witness the conflict. So as you can see here, when both of the agents attempt to cross the platform, none of the social allies are going to be able to see the conflict, leaving the two identically sized agents at a standstill. So we showed infants then two test events, one in which the agent from the smaller group won, and one in which the larger group won. And given that both agents were the same size, you might predict that neither agent is going to be more successful than the other, when none of the group members can see the conflict occurring. And here are some results. So in most of my graphs, I'll have the mean looking time on the y-axis and the test events on the x-axis. So as we anticipated, there was no significant difference between infants' looking time between the incident where the smaller group won or the larger group won, because both of the agents were identical in size, and it was hard for infants perhaps to predict who was going to win in this case. Therefore, they didn't just use the overall group size to predict who was going to win, but did take into account whether or not they were able to see the conflict occurring, and therefore might suggest that when you don't have people to see what's going on, then you're not going to get the advantage that you might if they're able to jump in and intervene. However, we still need a positive demonstration that visual access to the conflict will confer a competitive advantage. So in our second study, we decided to equate group size. However, in this study, we're going to have one group that's going to be able to see the conflict occurring. So in this case, it'll be the blue group, and the other group will be unable to see the conflict. So based on our prediction here, if it's about who can see the conflict and having more people being able to do so, in this case, we might predict that the blue group is going to be the one that's going to win in this competition. So we showed infants two types of test events, one in which the blue group was, or the green group was unaware of the conflict and the green member won, which we would anticipate is the unexpected outcome. Whereas we had the alternate outcome in which the blue group was able to see the conflict and was the purveyor of this competition. And this was what we would anticipate would be expected by infants. So similarly to our previous graph, we had the mean looking time on the y-axis and the two outcomes on the x-axis. And this time, we see a difference in infants' mean looking time. So they were longer to look at the unexpected outcome, where the agent's social allies were unable to see the conflict, compared to when they saw an agent whose social allies could see the conflict. So this suggests that they would be more surprised when an agent whose group members were unaware of the conflict got the right of way. So our main finding was further supported when the data was examined non-parametrically. So out of the 48 participants, 36 infants, or 75% of the sample, looked longer to the unexpected outcome compared to the expected trial. So therefore, it was not driven by a subset of infants with longer looking times. So just to sum up the study 1 and 2, infants expect that there might be strength in numbers when allies are aware of a conflict. And this might presuppose an expectation that social partners should be aiding group members when they are able to see and are able to help. However, in our 2 previous studies, we were unable to see whether or not the group members would actually act, and so we wanted to manipulate whether or not these group members would intervene or not. So the question we asked is, do infants expect members of the same group to intervene during a conflict? So there is some previous work that suggests that this might be the case. So in previous work by Rhodes et al., 16-month-old infants use social partnerships to predict behavior, such that infants expect conflict to generalize across social partnerships. In addition, work by Jin and Bayer-Jean found that 17-month-old infants expect in-group members to help each other, but helping out-group members is not expected. So in our third study, we wanted to know whether or not infants expect members of the same group to provide aid during a conflict. And we found that when we showed them two types of test events, one in which we had group size equated. Here we had two identically sized agents trying to cross the platform as in our other studies. However, in one test trial that will be shown here, the agent from the green group is going to hinder his own group member by pushing him off the platform, allowing the agent from the opposing group to accomplish their goal of crossing the platform. And we would expect that this would be surprising and unexpected to infants. Compared to this outcome, in which the agent from the green group will be helped by their own agent because the blue group will be hindered. So in these results, we showed that compared to the unexpected outcome, infants were more likely to think that agents should help their own group member and should not be hindering those from their own group. So they were more surprised to see when social partners did not aid a member of their own group, but instead went on and helped an opposing group member accomplish their goals. And so also when examining the data non-parametrically, we found the same kind of result where they were more surprised to see the unexpected outcome over the expected outcome. So overall, when social partners are aware of a conflict, we see that infants tend to expect them to provide aid, such that when group members are able to see what's happening and are able to see the conflict, then that confers a competitive advantage. However, this appears to be exclusive to own group members, suggesting that infants are not discriminating based on prosociality in general, so they're not necessarily just thinking that people should be helped overall, but that it should be specific to in-group members. So to sum up here, we find that infants expect members of the same group to form a united front during a conflict. So in general, they seem to understand that there is strength in numbers, and that they expect social partners to provide aid during a conflict. However, if they're unable to see the conflict, this kind of competitive advantage goes away, such that if you're unable to have someone on your side and we're standing here, and if someone else that you know needs help, you won't be able to aid them if you do not know what's happening. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I'd like to thank the families and the funding agencies that support all of our research at UBC and Science World out in Vancouver, Canada. Thank you.
We have 5 minutes for questions.
Hi. So I'm sorry if you might have explained this, and if you did, then I apologize for the question. But can you sort of say more about what aspects of these movies you assume should induce in infants interpretation of a conflict situation?
Right.
What should this conflict to be about, and also how those outcome test events should be, what in them should lead infants to certain interpretations?
Yes. So, for example, in the original studies, we have been interested in seeing exactly what components do sort of make people anticipate that someone's going to be more dominant than someone else or is going to get the right of way. In this particular case, we believe that when two people have competing goals and their goals are sort of hindered, if one person defers to the other or is submissive to one another, showing sort of like, in this case, I don't know if I put so I don't have the video where they bowed down. So we actually had a video where they would actually bow down to allow the other person to cross in front of them. So in a lot of animal societies, the postural differences between the dominant versus subordinate is really important to show that kinds of deference and indicates that the dominant is the one who's going to get the right of way. So I do believe that that's one component. I think that in this case, because we equated group size, there could be like this queue-based structure that even if you don't have necessarily the information about who's going to get the right of way based on physical size, that you can start to infer based on how many people are in the group. So you don't necessarily have to engage in a competition each time and put yourself at risk. You might just be able to predict that if you have 3 friends with you and there's 5 people who might cause you harm, that you probably shouldn't engage in a competition. So there's probably multiple aspects that are playing into it, but I think those are probably, in our case, the 2 most important ones here. Does that help answer your question?
So I'm not sure if I got this. So were those movies that you showed, were they preceded by some sort of familiarization where?
Yes,
okay.
yeah. So in the sake of time, because we only had 15 minutes, we both showed. So one group member from each green and blue group was able to cross the platform on their own without anyone hindering them. So it showed that they were capable of doing it on their own. But when it came to the intertrial where they were competing with one another, then they showed one of them would show deference to the other, and infants would see both outcomes, and we'd measure how long they would look to each of the test outcomes. So they did see each of the members be able to accomplish their goals on their own. Yes.
We have a question from Dan.
Thank you for your talk. A question about your identification of these as groups. You mentioned also coalition. There are at least 3 possible interpretations. One, there are group in the sense of enduring group. Another, there are a coalition that can be temporary or the duration of which is indeterminate. And also, there could be just different colors. There could be different kinds of organisms, of agents. But you seem to select the group interpretation. Are you committed to that? It's just the way you speak about it? And if you're committed to any such interpretation, is there any evidence in your data that favors it?
Right, so we tried to model some of the behaviors that had been shown by Lindsay, Powell, and Spelke, where if infants are seeing agents that act in a similar way or act synchronously and have a spatiotemporal sort of closeness, we tried to use all 3 of those components to depict that they're group members, since they did find that in their study with both 4-month-olds, 7-month-olds, that they tended to view those agents as part of the same group after behaving this way. But of course, I think that because these are novel groups, we also are in multiple types of social categories and groups in our life. So maybe depending on the context, if we established groups in another way and showed behaviors between, even if they're different colors perhaps, I think that infants would be able to make sense of the fact that if 2 group members are behaving in a particular way, similarly or synchronously or things like that, then they might interpret them as part of the same group at that time. But of course, like I said, with novel groups, you can change groups depending on what kinds of behaviors you're engaging in. So I don't think these groups are permanent.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone have a very short question? Yes, over there.
Was there a sex difference among the infants?
So we did not, in the studies that we were running for this particular one, just recognizing whether or not an agent was going to get the right of way or not, we did not find a gender difference in this particular study.
Let's thank Anthea again.
Thank you.